Welcome everyone to this third video on the character of George from Of Mice and Men. This video is very much focusing on George's dream and how he presents that dream all the way throughout the novella. And as always, this video is created with the WJEC GCSE English Literature Unit 1 exam in mind. This is going to help you with the second essay, the context essay, that will turn up in your exam. This is the third video that I've made on George. The first one was the danger that he's constantly perceiving, as well as how he seeks to protect his friend Lenny. The second video that I've sent out to you is George's frustrations and why he might be so frustrated. And in this video, I'll focus on George's dream. If you haven't seen the first two videos, I strongly recommend you watch them first. The first video in particular has lots of contextual information that I won't go over again, but will be useful as we look at George's dream. Before we start looking at what George's dream is and the way it's presented by Steinbeck, I'd like to introduce you to the concept of the American dream. Now, the American dream is often considered the national ethos of the USA, and it is one of the central themes in Of Mice and Men. So it's worth diving into this context so that you understand why we see so many characters with dreams that never come true. Phrase American Dream was first used by James Truslow Adams in his text, The Epic of America. He was a historian and he started to notice that people in America wanted the same things, but were having more and more difficulty in actually attaining it. And in his text, this is what he said. The American dream is that dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability or achievement. It is not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely, but a dream of social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are innately capable, and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position. I think the dream itself is quite a pleasant one. We've spoken in previous videos about the idea of a meritocracy. In a meritocracy, people will achieve if they are willing to work for it. If you are talented and hardworking, you can achieve anything. Now, if we think of Mice and Men, we see that the type of society presented by the microcosm of the ranch doesn't seem to be a meritocracy. If it was a meritocracy, we would see people like Slim and people like George achieving. And yet they don't really. The people with power and status are simply those who are lucky. We have the boss and we have Curly. They haven't worked harder than anyone else to achieve what they have. They've just been lucky enough to attain it. And I think that goes against the idea of the American dream. And I think one of the central reasons why Steinbeck writes his novella is to show us that the American dream has become a fallacy. It's a fake dream. It no longer exists. Everyone might strive for it, but very few people actually attain it. And I think the words of Crooks, where everybody has a piece of land in their head, but nobody ever gets it, is probably as close to Steinbeck's reason for writing this novella. And this links in perfectly with George's dream, because George's dream isn't to be rich, George's dream isn't to be powerful, George's dream is to be self-sufficient, so that he no longer has to continually move from ranch to ranch searching for jobs, working with people who are unkind, working for people who don't work hard themselves. And more than anything, he wants to escape the hardships of the 1930s, to escape the horrible cycle of living in the Great Depression. In the first chapter of Mice and Men, we see hints as to what George's real dream might be. He tells Lenny that he doesn't want to go straight to the ranch, and he actually wants to stay in the brush for a little bit, in that scene of nature with the pool. He says, "I like it here. Tonight, I'm going to lay right here and look up. I like it." And I think there's a reason why he doesn't want to go straight to the job and he would prefer to spend time out in nature. And that's because his real dream is to be free. Free of hardship, free of living in Darwinian societies, places of hardship like ranches. His dream is to be free from all of those pressures. And it continues when he says, "It's going to be nice sleeping here, looking up and the leaves." So I think from the very beginning, we see that George's dream is not one of riches, it's not one of power, but one of freedom. He wants to escape the Great Depression. Now, in that first chapter, we also see that George's voice became deeper when he starts to tell Lenny the shared dream that they have of the place of their own. It says he repeated his words rhythmically, as though he had said them many times before. And I think the adverb rhythmically there is quite interesting. Rhythmically suggests that George has said this lots of times before, almost like it's a bedtime story for Lenny, or almost like it's a nursery rhyme to control Lenny's behavior. But there's also an element of perhaps religious chanting here as well. He is rhythmically telling us about his dream, almost like he's praying for it, almost like he dreams that one day perhaps it will come true, even though we know that George perhaps doesn't believe it is ever going to become true. The fact that his voice becomes deeper shows that sense of longing for the future. It becomes deeper, almost like he becomes a storyteller for Lenny. And I think there's a real warmth in George's voice when he allows himself that temporary escape through this dream. It's almost like it's something that keeps him going. And he tells us what his dream is. He tells us that guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. They got no family. They don't belong no place. And in that, George is very much outlining the problem with some of American society during the 1930s. That people feel like they don't belong in the world. Like people don't have a purpose. People don't feel like success is actually possible. People started to feel more lonely. If you're someone who has to move around constantly to work on different ranches because work dries up, if you're an itinerant or migrant worker, you are further and further away from where you were born. You lose that sense of belonging and those roots that you put down early in life. And what we have is this idea that people have become lost. And maybe George's dream is actually to find a place where he actually belongs. And he tells us the problem with working on these ranches. They come to a ranch and work up a stake, and then they go into town and blow their stake. And the first thing you know, they're pounding their tail on some other ranch. They ain't got nothing to look ahead to. And what he describes there is the unfortunate life of itinerant workers during the 1930s, where you get a job, you work for a little bit until the work dries up, and then you move on to another job. It's that horrible, vicious cycle that he wants to escape. Because at the moment, George is stuck in that cycle. He needs the money, so he does the work. He has to spend the money to keep himself alive, so he has to get another job where he has to continue working. What he really wants to do is to escape this pernicious cycle that he can't seem to get out of. And he tells us that most people, they spend their money maybe on some sort of temporary escape, on whiskey or going to cat houses like he mentions later in the novella. But what they really do is they seek to escape whilst actually still being stuck in the horrible cycle. George can see the problem. The problem is at the moment he has no way of actually escaping it. And this is what he wants to get out of. You have to find work. If you're lucky enough to find it, you have to move to a new job. If you are completing that job, eventually the job will finish, and then you're stuck at the beginning of the cycle, finding work again, moving to a new job, finishing the job. He wants to escape that pernicious cycle. And then he tells us how actually he is going to be able to find an escape. Because what he focuses on is the fact that he does value friendship and he does have someone to look after him. He says, with us, it ain't like that. We got a future. We got somebody to talk to that gives a damn about us. And I think that's a really important note from Steinbeck. After all, it's one of the central themes of the novella. If you can't escape that hardship, you can at least be kind to the other people who are going through those times of suffering and times of pain. I think Steinbeck is advocating for everyone being nicer to each other because the world is a hard place. And this is what Lenny says. And why? Because I got you to look after me and you got me to look after you, and that's why. So even though they are unlikely to ever attain their dream, it's their friendship that will keep themselves going. And George actually starts to describe what the dream is actually going to be when it starts to materialize out of this dream. He says, someday. And I really like the fact that Steinbeck uses the word someday. It's almost as if this is a pipe dream, something that exists in the future. George doesn't know when it will happen, and he probably knows it never will. But there's still hope that perhaps someday he will find that escape. And he tells us we're going to get the Jack together. And we're going to have a little house on a couple of acres and a cow and some pigs. And I think the things that he actually populates his dream with tell us a lot about George's real dream. George doesn't have dreams of enormous riches. George doesn't want to be famous like Curly's wife. The adjective little tells us that George's dream is actually quite a simple, quite a basic dream of just having a place where he can belong. So the pre-modifying adjective little is probably worth commenting on to show that he has actually quite a humble dream. And to be honest, it's the type of dream that American society would like to believe is possible. That if you work really hard, maybe you have a place where you can live and be happy. And again, that links in with this lexical set of not asking for too much, because he says a couple of acres. He's not asking for an enormous ranch. His dream is quite humble, but he wants a couple of acres so that he can plant crops, so that he can work hard but actually benefit from that hard work. And where he says a cow and some pigs, he wants the cow and pigs so that he can feed himself. It doesn't seem like too much. If you ever look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the things that people actually need in life are quite low at the bottom of the triangle. And it tells us that all he's really asking for there is shelter and food. It's not too much to ask. Now, Lenny tells us that their dream is to live off the fat of the land. And that means that their real dream is to be self-sufficient, so that they don't have to be reliant on anyone else. At the beginning of this novella, George and Lenny are very much reliant on employment. And if we look at the boss, who doesn't seem like a particularly kind man, and if we look at Curly, who is aggressive, what they want to do is escape constantly having to go to jobs and to work for people they don't like and not actually benefit from their labor. Live off the fat of the land, I think, symbolically tells us that they want to escape the Great Depression, escape migrant working, and just have a place that they can still work hard but actually benefit from themselves. They don't have dreams of riches. Now, Lenny becomes almost obsessed with this dream, and he says, tell about what we're going to have in the garden, and about the rabbits in the cages, and about the rain in the winter, and the stove, and how thick the cream is on the milk, like you can hardly cut it. The dream is almost heavenly, and I think there is definitely an element of the Garden of Eden being described. This place of innocence where happiness can actually be attained. Where it says garden and rabbits and rain, it's all incredibly natural. And I think there's an element of their dream to suggest that the world actually gives us everything we need, and all we have to do is to take it. But in the 1930s, which was becoming an increasingly capitalist society, what you had was some people owning land and being able to take that money from the land, and other people not owning that land, which means they're almost locked out of wealth or success. Now, I think the word stove is used deliberately. That stove symbolizes the warmth that they can obtain being in this type of dream together. And again, it's all focused on quite basic things, like having a safe place to actually live, or rain that comes from the sky that we can drink, or cream that we can eat. It's all a very basic dream that any American citizen should be allowed to attain. And that dream of a self-sufficient lifestyle continues when George says, we'll have a big vegetable patch and a rabbit hutch and chickens. And when it rains in the winter, we'll just say the hell with going to work. And we'll build up a fire in the stove and sit around and listen to the rain coming down on the roof. And you can see the vegetable patch again being a place where they can work hard and actually reap the rewards of their own hard work. But where it says when it rains in the winter, George wants the ability to say, I don't want to work in the rain. He wants to have the opportunity to say no to work. At the moment, George has to say yes to work because he needs the money. He'd like to be in control of his own life and not have to work through hardship constantly just to make somebody else rich. And you can see that when George tells Lenny that they can't leave the ranch because they need the money, even though he can see it's not a very nice place. And George uses this dream to control Lenny, much like a parent might control their child by telling them they won't get a treat if they don't act appropriately. He says, but you ain't going to get in no trouble, because if you do, I won't let you tend no rabbits. When George talks to Slim later on in the novella, he explains that it's more than just being self-sufficient. He says, if I was even a little bit smart, I'd have my own little place and I'd be bringing my own crops instead of doing all the work and not getting what comes up out of the ground. And I think what Steinbeck highlights here is that when employers have so much power, and in the 1930s Great Depression, they did have a lot of power because there was so much excess labor available in the workplace, because there were so many potential employees, because unemployment was so high, they had all of the power. And I think Steinbeck is showing us that when employers have that much power and employees have no power at all, it verges on exploitation. Yes, they're getting paid. Of course, they're getting paid for their labor, but they're not being fairly paid for what they're actually contributing. So it seems to be the richer people at the top of the hierarchy are gleaning all of that money, and it's not trickling down to the people actually doing the work. So I think it is a comment on how capitalism can exploit people at the bottom of the pyramid. Later on, when we see George telling the story once more to Lenny, he says, well, it's 10 acres, said George. Got a little windmill, got a little shack on it and a chicken run, got a kitchen, orchards, cherries, apples, peaches, carts, nuts, got a few berries. There's a place for alfalfa and plenty of water to flood it. There's a pig pen. Now, he uses an asyndetic list in the middle of that quote, where he lists all of the different things that are available on this farm. And again, that shows us that the world naturally gives us everything we possibly need. The world gives us food and water, and they cost absolutely nothing. They're just there, they grow out of the ground. What he seems to long for is a simpler life, where you have a natural relationship with the world and the world supplies you. And that's not what he has in this novella. Now, as he tells this story, he was playing solitaire, he was playing with cards. And that's almost like another distraction from his hardship, where he plays arbitrary games just to keep himself busy. But when he starts talking about the dream, George's hands stopped working with the cards. His voice was growing warmer. And I think that warmth is really important, because the American dream allows him to escape from the coldness and the harshness of a Darwinian society like the 1930s. So his voice was growing warmer. That dream actually pulls him out of his unhappiness for just a little bit. When he continues his description, we get to this quotation, which I think is more complex than it seems at first glance. He says, I could build a smokehouse like the one Grandpa had. Now, yes, okay, that means that he's just going to build something on this ranch so that he can smoke meat. But the phrase, like the one Grandpa had, I think is really important. Because it seems to be that his relatives, his past generations, people that he knew from his own family, had been able to attain the American dream. His grandfather clearly has the dream that George has always wanted. But it seems to be that George, possibly just out of bad luck of being born into the 1930s, is locked out from the type of dream that his relatives were able to attain. And I think there is a feeling of unfairness there. And I think what George really wants is to almost go back in time to a time that success was actually possible in. And he continues and he tells us that, and when the salmon run up river, we could catch 'em, 100 of 'em, and salt 'em down or smoke 'em. And in this quotation, again, yes, it's more food and that the world naturally gives to people, and all you need to do is pluck them from the river. But the fact that he wants to salt them down or smoke them shows that he actually wants to preserve that food so he can plan for the future. So he doesn't have to live day by day. At the moment, he lives paycheck by paycheck. He gets his money, he tries to save it but can't. and then gets more money and then tries to save it but can't. But if in his dream, he's actually planning for the future. To salt them down or to smoke them means to preserve them so that he'll have food for later. And I think that will take away some of the anxiety of constantly looking for the next job that he currently has to go through. And that's the same sentiment that we see that when the fruit come in, we could can it. Now, fruit naturally rots, it will disintegrate. But he has plans to can the fruit, again, to preserve it so that he has it for the future. So he can actually look after himself in the long term rather than at the moment, which is living day by day, month by month. I actually think it's really sad when George says we'd just live there. We'd belong there. Now, the historian who came up with the phrase the American dream actually goes into a little bit more detail, and he talks to his audience about how people actually have two educations. And the first education is how to earn a living, how to go to work and how to earn money. And that's a really important thing to learn. But in his writing, he then tells us that if we focus too much on just earning a living, you actually need to learn how to live too. And there's a difference between earning a living and actually living. So I think there's a part of me that thinks that George at the moment is just living to work. But what he really dreams of is being able to actually live in the moment, be able to enjoy his time on earth rather than just survive. And I think there is a difference between surviving and living. Now, where it says we'd belong there, I think that shows that he doesn't belong here. He doesn't belong on ranches. None of the men really belong there. They're only there because they need to earn money. What George wants is a place of safety. And I think belonging suggests a sense of family and companionship. What he wants is a place where he actually fits in, a place that values him, a place that actually allows him to thrive, rather than constantly keeping him moving around the country. And that's what he doesn't want anymore. He says there wouldn't be no more running around the country and getting fed by a Jap cook. No, sir. We'd have our own place where we belonged, not sleep in no bunkhouse. Now, where it says running round the country, I think that's quite an important phrase, because if you're simply running around, there is no actual destination. People who are moving from job to job to job to job, they're actually not going anywhere. They're simply moving around where the work is, instead of actually having a place to belong. So running around the country, I think we've got that sense of isolation that comes from migrant or itinerant working in the 1930s. And that's what he's trying to break away from. And when it says where we belonged and not sleep in no bunkhouse, now in bunkhouses there are lots of men sleeping in the same room, which should suggest that everyone are close and there's camaraderie and there's companionship. I think what he shows us is that these bunkhouses are actually very lonely places, because nobody really wants to form friendships because they're constantly moving around the country. So what's the point? So what he really shows us is that he wants a place that he can actually belong. And he tells us we'd have a little house and a room to ourselves. And that's what he really wants. A place where Lenny can be safe, a place where he can feel like he belongs, so that he no longer has to live on these hostile ranches that he's constantly moving to. This dream is a dream of warmth instead of coldness. He tells us that there's a little fat iron stove, and in the winter we'd keep a fire going in it. Now, I think the winter there really symbolizes the hardship of the world, but the fact that they'd be able to sustain a fire shows that if they had a little place of their own, they would be insulated from that hardship. They'd have protection from it. And his dream isn't to work so hard that he doesn't get to enjoy life. He says it ain't enough land, so we'd have to work too hard, maybe 6, 7 hours a day. And I think that's a fairly respectable amount of time to be willing to dedicate to work. George tells us that he doesn't want to work 11 hours a day doing hard labor because that feels like exploitation. Instead, what he wants is a greater balance between earning a living and actually living his life. And where it says we wouldn't have to buck no barley 11 hours a day, I think the word have shows that at the moment he has no choice. But I think in the future, George would like the choice. He could continue working for 11 hours a day if he really wants to be rich, but I don't think George's dream is about material gain. I think it's more about gaining a sense of happiness and belonging and safety and comfort. Now, I think this is one of the most important quotes because he then says, and when we put in a crop, why? We'd be there to take the crop up. We'd know what come of our planting. In George's current life, he does the work and then the job is finished and then he moves on and he never actually sees the crop coming out of the ground. Now, what George wants is to be in the same place for a long enough time so he can see the fruits of his labor. He wants to know that all of the hard work that he invests is actually worth it. He can benefit from his own hard work because at the moment, only the boss and Curly actually benefit from all of the work that the people on the ranch do. So he wants to be around so he can feel like he is succeeding. Now, when he describes this dream, he mentions the fact that he'd keep a few pigeons to go flying around the windmill like they'd done when I was a kid. And this is where I'd like to focus in on the word pigeons. Now, we've seen birds mentioned a few times in this text. When we talked about Curly's wife, we mentioned the ostrich feathers and how ostriches are flightless birds and therefore symbolize how she is trapped on this ranch. We've also talked about the pigeon that flies around the barn and escapes when Curly's wife dies, perhaps symbolizing how she only finds escape through death. And I think here, this pigeon again symbolizes freedom. And I think what George wants is that freedom from the Great Depression. And the fact that he mentions when I was a kid, before the time of the 1930s, it's almost like he wants to go back in time to a time where success was possible. Because the 1930s was a time where it was very difficult to succeed. And he also tells us that it would be our own and nobody could can us. Now, the word can there to mean to be sacked or to be fired, I think is really important because at the moment, George and Lenny live in constant fear of being unemployed. And you can see that with George protecting Lenny from the boss. And you can see that when they can't leave, and you can see it when George tells Slim that they need the work and that they had to come up with an excuse as to why Curly had been hurt. What George wants to get out of is the constant fear of being sacked. And we see that in the character of Candy as well. It must be really emasculating for someone like Candy, desperately trying to cling on to a job. And it says, if we don't like a guy, we can say, get the hell out, and by God, he's got to do it. So George wants to be in charge of his own life. He doesn't want to have to tolerate unkindness anymore. And you see it all the way throughout the book. George can see danger and unkindness, but he's actually powerless to protect Lenny from it. He sees the danger of Curly. Curly does hurt Lenny. He sees the danger of Curly's wife. Curly's wife does lead to Lenny's demise. So what George wants is he wants to have the authority to be in control of his own life. Because at the moment, like many people in the 1930s, he isn't. And he also mentions friendship. And if a friend come along, why, we'd have an extra bunk and we'd say, why don't you spend the night? And by God, he would. So George's dream is to have a place where warmth and kindness and friendship can actually flourish. And it sounds like the type of place that George would actually be able to protect Lenny. Now, I think we would all agree that George doesn't really believe that that dream will ever come true until he starts talking to Candy. It says that George sat entranced by his own picture. Now, the word entranced shows that he is longing for this dream. This is the thing that he wants more than anything. But the fact that it's his own picture, I think it shows that he'd like to be in charge. He'd like to have his own life that he could actually be the painter for. But I think his own picture also shows that it's a little bit two-dimensional. And that's because it's not actually going to exist. It's almost too good to be true. When Candy starts asking about the dream, George becomes instantly defensive. It says that George was on guard immediately. "Suppose I do," he said. "What's that to you?" And I think that shows that George would do anything to protect this dream, to protect this chance of success in the future. Now, Candy, very, very quickly, he's only met these men for a very short amount of time. He is willing to give George and Lenny all of his money in order to have a chance at this dream with them. And when George finds out that Candy could make this dream come true, he starts to entertain the idea that perhaps Candy is the secret to actually attaining this dream. And then he says, "Well, I could get it for $600. The old people that owns it is flat bust, and the old lady needs an operation." Now, this quote, yes, it tells us how much the farm will cost, but more than that, I think it tells us about what society in the 1930s was like. The only reason why these people are willing to sell their farm is because the old people who owns it need to pay for an operation. Now, we've talked a lot about how the vulnerable weren't really protected during the 1930s. We've seen that with Candy. But the people who are selling this farm are only doing it out of desperate need. They need medical care and they have to pay for that medical care. So on the one hand, it shows that George has an opportunity to buy that success. But on the other hand, it shows just how easy it is to lose that success. These people with this ranch clearly don't want to sell it, but they're going to have to sell it because they've fallen ill. Again, it shows us the Darwinian nature of the 1930s. You have people who are strong and you have people who are weak, and the weak invariably suffer. When Candy offers the money, they fell into a silence. They looked at one another amazed. This thing they had never really believed in was coming true. Again, I think that's evidence to show that George never really believed that he would ever attain the American dream. And then George said reverently, "Jesus Christ, I bet we could swing her." His eyes were full of wonder. "I bet we could swing her," he repeated softly. I think that repetition is almost this idea of he's awestruck at the idea of this dream coming true. Then they all sat still, all bemused by the beauty of the thing. Each mind popped into the future when this lovely thing should come about. I think the phrase "popped into the future" there really shows us that this dream is about escape. They're all trying to escape their current lives, this lived experience of misery on the ranch. What they're really looking for is success for the future, a chance in life. George really starts to invest himself that maybe they could attain this dream. He says, "Suppose there was a carnival or a circus come to town or a ball game or any damn thing. We'd just go to her. We wouldn't ask nobody if we could." And if you look at the lexical set there of carnival, circus, ball game, those are all pieces of language to describe leisure activities, enjoyable things. Because at the moment, George's life has very little pleasure in it. What George can see is perhaps in the future, maybe he will be able to attain a life where he can actually enjoy life. And where it says we just go to her, we wouldn't ask nobody, again, it shows he wants to be the architect of his own life. He doesn't want to be at the mercy of employers like the boss and Curly anymore. Well, he is very protective of this dream. He says, don't tell nobody about it. Just us three and nobody else. They're liable to can us, so we can't make no mistake. Now, George is very aware that the world is a very hostile place, so he tries to protect the little chance in life that he seems to have been able to get for himself. Now, we know that both Candy and Lenny both tell people about their dream. They both mention it in front of Crooks. And I think that's because they're so excited that they can hardly contain themselves. But George wants them to be protective because something like the dream needs protecting because it is so fragile. And we know it's so fragile because during the 1930s, the American dream wasn't really a dream at all. It was almost a false dream, a fake dream, almost cruel that the world told you could be successful, when in reality that success was incredibly difficult to come by. So I think Steinbeck is very much showing us that the American dream has become almost taunting. But as we get to the 5th chapter, we know that that dream expires, that dream disappears, and that dream very much ends once and for all. And what's really sad is that George admits, I think I knowed from the very first. I think I knowed we'd never do it. You used to like to hear about it so much, I got to thinking maybe we would. And I think this is an interesting point because George's cynicism, he's quite a cynical person, he sees all the danger in the world. Because of George's dream, he almost became positive. He almost had something to look forward to. And I think Steinbeck is making the point that if people don't have anything to live for, if people don't have anything to strive for, if they don't believe that they have a future or they have a chance at success, people will become really cynical. And as we look at some of the other characters, particularly someone like Carlson, that cynicism doesn't make the world a better place, it makes it worse. And at the end of the novel, we see what George's real life is going to be for the foreseeable future. There is no chance at gaining success, no chance at attaining that dream. He tells us that he is just going to be like any other person on the ranch. When we first saw George and Lenny, they were special because they actually had a bond and friendship. At the end of this novella, George just becomes another faceless, itinerant ranch hand. He says, I'll work my month and I'll take my $50 and I'll stay all night in some lousy cat house. Or I'll sit in some pool room till everybody goes home. And then I'll come back and work another month and I'll have $50 more. Now George gives up and just accepts the hardship that is given to him. He's going to use the money to find just temporary, very unsubstantial forms of escape through cat houses or pool rooms or whiskey. And what's really sad is that George has to just accept the fact that his life is going to be empty and not mean anything, and he's never going to be able to succeed. Now, we had real hopes for George at the start of this novella. By the end of the text, we can see that he has no hope at all. I think that's Steinbeck's way of showing us that during the 1930s, people didn't have a chance at the American dream. The American dream is almost an illusion, and that's really frustrating for the people of America. Thank you very much for watching this revision video on the character of George and the theme of dreams. Now, I could have gone into all of the other dreams that we see in the text, from Curly's wife's dream and Candy's dream and even Crooks's dream, but this video is very much focused on the character of George. I really hope it's useful. I really hope this gives you enough to write a really informed essay on the character of George. If you haven't watched the first 2 videos, please watch them. It will mean that you are very capable of writing an interesting and informed essay on the character of George if he turns up in your exam. Good luck with your final exams. I will see you guys next time.